Instead of pursuing peace, Russia and Assad make war. Instead of helping get life-saving aid to civilians, Russia and Assad are bombing the humanitarian convoys.
As a result, in Syria, hundreds of armed groups are being further armed. The territory of the country is being bombed indiscriminately, and bringing a peace is almost an impossible task now.
At least 400,000 lives lost, 6.5 million people internally displaced, and more than 4.8 million refugees. It's the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. But after more than 5 years of war, the United Nations is still unable to bring an end to the conflict in Syria. No direct intervention, no peacekeeping force, no teeth to ensure ceasefires are held. No way to guarantee aid gets delivered to the people who desperately need it. And accusations that some Security Council members are working to sabotage efforts to find peace.
Russia and Assad have reportedly launched more than 150 airstrikes over the last 72 hours, killing at least 139 people and injuring hundreds more.
As people in Aleppo despair and more civilians are killed, the United Nations appears more powerless and ineffective than ever. And hope and faith in the body, created to maintain international peace and security, is quickly fading. The United Nations was founded in October 1945 in the wake of World War II to try to stop the same atrocities ever happening again. The Security Council is the UN's most powerful body, the only one with the authority to issue legally binding resolutions that can be backed up by sanctions, peacekeepers, or by armed forces. It has 10 non-permanent members that are elected for 2-year terms, and 5 permanent members: China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. For a resolution to be passed, 9 of the 15 members must vote for it. But the 5 permanent members have the ability to veto. When it comes to Syria, this has paralysed the UN from taking any meaningful action, because Bashar al-Assad's biggest supporter, Russia, can block any Security Council move. Is peace in Syria an impossible task, while Security Council members have the power to wield a veto? And if it's to fulfill its mission of maintaining peace, does the United Nations need to change? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me here in studio is Mark Kimmitt, the former US Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. And from Beirut, I'm joined by the international law expert Diala Shehada. Both of you, thank you very much for joining us. Diala Shehada, let me start with you. So we had this emergency session of the UN Security Council on Syria. It ended with no result, no change, no action, because Russia, the United States, the UK, and the French bickered, called each other names. Nothing happened. Is the UN facing a crisis of relevance now more than ever?
The Security Council can always be relevant if there was a serious political will to make a change in Syria. Apparently, all the major powers are involved directly and sometimes indirectly in the armed conflict in Syria, but there is no such will to end the war or to reach a transitional phase in order to reach peace in Syria. Russia is getting more and more involved, even in violations of the law of war in Syria. The major human rights groups such as Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and other groups have been reporting of use of airstrikes against civilians and even humanitarian workers in Syria since the beginning of 2016. We cannot imagine how a Security Council could reach a consensus on peace or on the stop of hostilities in Syria, while some of the veto holders are actually directly involved in hostilities against civilians as well.
Mark Kimmitt, let me then pose it to you. Can the UN do anything at the Security Council while one of the members of the Security Council is an active belligerent in the conflict in Syria and might potentially be committing war crimes?
Well, first of all, I think it goes beyond potentially committing war crimes and crimes against humanity to actually doing that. The answer is as long as one of the Security Council members does not agree with the process, one of the permanent members can veto any actions proposed by any of the 4 perm reps, we're not going to get anywhere. And at this point, the lines have been drawn between the Americans and the coalition fighting in Syria and the Russians to the point where it would take a tremendous act of diplomacy to get the UN to actually come across with a decision that would make a difference.
Diala, Staffan de Mistura said, this council has the responsibility to relaunch the cessation of hostilities. And I wonder, with everything that's emerged over the past 5 years or so, is it really the council's responsibility anymore? Have we moved so far beyond needing the UN Security Council now because this has become a global problem of absolute and utter chaos right now?
Unfortunately, it's up to the Security Council to make decisions on war and peace when it comes to the Charter of the United Nations. The General Assembly cannot take such decisions, even by the extreme majority of the state parties. So it is still the responsibility of the Security Council, but such a responsibility has proven to be not responsible, actually, when it comes to conflict of international nature, such as Syrian conflict, where some of the veto holders, as said, are directly involved and have apparently no will to have a close end to this conflict. So the responsibility remains at the Security Council when it comes to issuing decisions to stop the war, or at least to condemn the violations, at least in Syria. But we haven't seen anything positive, or at least anything serious, since 2014.
Mark Emmett, looking at some of the statements from the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, she says what Russia is sponsoring and doing is not counterterrorism, it is barbarism. Instead of pursuing peace, Russia and Assad make war. And she goes on and talks about them bombing humanitarian convoys, hospitals, first responders who are trying desperately to keep people alive. She's joined by Matthew Rycroft, the UK ambassador to the UN, saying the regime in Russia have instead plunged to new depths and unleashed a new hell on Aleppo. So they're saying all of this while Vitaly Churkin's sitting across the table from them. I wonder, in terms of diplomacy, given that the United States and others need the Russians to help put a lid on what's happening in Syria, are they maybe antagonizing the Russians, and might this be counterproductive?
No, I don't think it's antagonizing at all. It's just clear, direct language. Look, the Russians have a position inside of Syria. They are treating anyone who is in opposition to the Assad regime as a terrorist, and as a result have no motivation at all to change their position. They have strategic reasons to support Assad, primarily a desire to maintain their warm water port inside the Mediterranean and to increase their influence in the Middle East. So why should they care?
You were part of the Bush administration when you went to war in Iraq. You didn't go to the Security Council. Kofi Annan a year later said that it was illegal. Does somebody need to make a decision without using the UN Security Council, as you did in 2003?
Possibly so. I mean, there have been a number of operations conducted over the past 30 years where coalitions of the willing have been established to bypass the UN mechanism. I don't think the UN is necessarily defunct or broken, but it may not be the appropriate venue when you have, as you say, two of the parties being generally active belligerents in the conflict. It may be the need to set up a coalition of the willing, which in fact we have done inside Iraq for the purposes of conducting both the Iraq and the Syria operations.
But President Obama he seems to be, looking at his track record over a period of 8 years, desperate to preserve these international institutions. He believes in them. Is that ever likely to change over the next few months?
Well, I think the notion that he set up a coalition of the willing to support the rebels inside Syria has demonstrated that he has changed his view. Expediency and necessity sometimes trumps virtue and values.
Diala, would you like somebody to skirt the UN and act outside of the boundaries of the UN Security Council to do something, anything, to try to stop the bloodshed in Syria?
Well, there are lots of, or several other options when it comes to the prosecutions of individual responsible for violations of laws, for the international humanitarian war crimes and crimes against humanity. For instance, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, wasn't established by decision of the Security Council or the UN. A group of countries, of states that support the prosecutions of individuals responsible for such crimes can simply agree on a statement to establish an international special tribunal for Syria at any moment. So we haven't seen this, although dozens of countries in the West and also the Arab countries have been speaking about a referral by the necessity of a referral by the Security Council to the ICC of The Hague. We haven't heard them speaking of establishing a special tribunal for Syria, although it is possible from an international legal view. So what I think is there's a lot of hypocrisy in all these diplomatic talks about trying to put an end or to find tools to prevent the commitment of further crimes in Syria, because there are always other options than the Security Council, but there isn't any political will, in my opinion, to do so.
Yeah, Mark Emmett, do you agree that there's no political will right now?
Oh, I think there's a lot of political will, but not between the parties inside the UN. And to go back to your point about does this have to be done through the UN, again, if you take a look at some of the most recent conflicts, the Bosnian War inside of the former Yugoslavia was not ended through the United Nations, but was done through the Dayton Peace Accords. The war in Korea was not initially done through the United Nations, but only when the Russians walked out were we able to put together a coalition to fight the North Koreans. So it is not unprecedented that the UN is bypassed in the process of bringing peace and stability to regions. We always prefer it, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a necessity.
Just broadening this out for the last couple of minutes or so, Diala, the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd wrote a very powerful piece recently talking of this argument of a sort of natural law of entropy, and in any international order, once established, it tends to sort of decline and decay, and he says that the UN is going through that process of entropy right now, which is why it needs to be reformed, which is why it needs to be reimagined. Do you share those views, Diala?
Definitely, definitely. This is not the first time where Security Council resolutions are totally ignored, or Security Council veto holders are not able to reach a consensus on a certain conflict or war that is putting at risk the whole region, the peace and the integrity of the whole region surrounding it. So I think it is not the first time where international community understand that the Security Council, in terms of the veto system, is not working. It has failed, I think, since the 60s and the 70s, and we can see also with the example of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that none of the decisions issued by the Security Council was respected at any time. So maybe it's the time to start drafting, or to start even at least negotiating a new system, and it's up to the diplomacy of the majority of the UN state parties to try to impose such a new proposition.
Mark Emmett, very finally, I remember when John Bolton was the US ambassador to the UN, he almost gave the impression that he didn't want to be there and he thought the place was a waste of time, right? But there are a lot of people within the United States, having lived and worked there for a while, who have that feeling that the UN is the sort of waste of time. Do you think that it can still be reformed and still be relevant in the year 2016 and beyond, and serve the purpose that it was designed for? And if you had to change anything, what would you change?
Well, first of all, let's recall that the UN still does tremendously good work in some of their committees. High Commission for Refugees. There are a number of ways in which the UN is doing good work. It is the United Nations Security Council that seems to be in need of reform, because it is set up, first of all, it's set up for a post-1945 World War II scenario where Britain and France were among the largest nations in the world. It needs to be reformed in terms of who its members are. It also needs perhaps to be reformed to one which one of the permanent members cannot veto, but it has to be done by consensus. But again, all bring their own problems. But as long as the reform will require the votes of the very people that enjoy the position that they maintain the veto, I don't think it's ever going to happen in the near term.
Okay. On that note, unfortunately, I've got to wrap because we are out of time. Diala Shehadeh and Mark Kimmett, thank you very much for joining us.